Every Friday, my wife secretly visited her first husband's grave. She never told me outright. I noticed it the way an old man notices small changes, the pause before she answered, the careful way she chose her words, the habit of checking the clock every Friday afternoon. For years, she said she was going out for errands or visiting an old friend. I never pressed her. At my age, you learn that some questions are better left alone, especially when peace has already become fragile. But patterns have a way of revealing themselves, no matter how carefully they're hidden. Every Friday, at the same hour, she would leave the house dressed a little more carefully than usual. Not elegant, not festive, just deliberate. Her movements were quiet, her expression closed, as if she were stepping into a world that no longer included me. She would return before sunset, calm, composed and distant, in a way that lingered long after she set her keys down. At first, I told myself it was grief. Her first husband had died decades ago, long before she met me. I respected that history. Everyone carries ghosts. I assumed this was her way of honoring a chapter she never fully closed. Love doesn't erase the past. It just learns to live beside it. That's what I believed. That's what I wanted to believe. But as the months turned into years, the feeling in my chest began to change. It wasn't jealousy. It was something colder. A quiet unease that crept in without permission. I began to notice how carefully she avoided details. How she never mentioned the cemetery's name. How she never brought flowers back home. How she washed her hands the moment she returned, standing at the sink longer than necessary, staring at her reflection like she was trying to recognize herself again. One Friday afternoon, I watched from the living room window as she drove away. The street was silent, the sky heavy with gray clouds. Something in me shifted. I didn't follow her that day. I just sat there, listening to the house breathe around me, feeling the weight of years settle into my bones. Trust, once cracked, doesn't shatter loudly. It erodes quietly. The next Friday I followed. I kept my distance, careful not to be seen. My heart pounded harder than it should have, not from fear, but from the realization that I was stepping beyond a line I had respected my entire life. The cemetery was old, tucked away behind rows of dying trees and rusted gates. I parked far enough back to remain unseen and watched as she walked in alone, her posture straight, her steps familiar. She didn't hesitate. She knew exactly where she was going. I waited, minutes passed. Then more. She knelt at one grave in particular, but I couldn't see the name from where I stood. She didn't cry. She didn't pray. She just sat there, still, as if listening. That was the moment the cold truly settled in my chest. Grief usually moves. This felt intentional. When she finally left, I stayed behind. I walked closer, my footsteps slow, my hands trembling slightly. I stood before the grave she had visited and read the name carved into the stone. It was her first husband. The dates were there. The ending was final. Or at least, it should have been. I returned home without saying a word. That night, sleep refused to come. My mind replayed the image of her sitting there, silent, composed, as if the grave itself had something to offer her that I never could. And for the first time since we had married, I felt like a guest in my own life. Weeks passed. I watched more closely, listened more carefully. Every Friday confirmed the same truth. Whatever she was doing at that grave went far beyond remembrance. It was ritual. It was obligation. It was something she needed, and something she was hiding from me with purpose. Then came the day that changed everything. A storm had passed through the night before, leaving the ground soft and the air heavy. I stood at the edge of the cemetery alone, staring at that same grave, my heart beating loud enough to drown out reason. I don't know what pushed me to do it. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was the exhaustion of carrying unanswered questions for too long. Or maybe it was the quiet realization that some truths demand to be uncovered, no matter the cost. I brought a shovel. The earth gave way easier than I expected. Each strike sent a dull ache through my arms and a deeper one through my chest. I worked slowly, deliberately, stopping more than once to steady my breath. The world around me felt unreal, muted, as if time itself had chosen to look away. When the metal finally struck something solid, my hands froze. I brushed the dirt aside, my breath shallow, my mind screaming at me to stop. But I didn't. I leaned closer, my heart pounding so violently I thought it might give out right there among the graves. And what I saw next made the cold lock into my bones. I froze in terror. I stood there longer than I should have, staring down into the grave as if my eyes might suddenly correct what they were seeing. The air felt heavy, pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. My hands were still wrapped around the shovel handle, but I no longer felt its weight. Everything below my shoulders felt numb, detached, like my body had decided this truth was too much to process all at once. The coffin lid was not sealed the way it should have been. It wasn't broken. It wasn't damaged by time or decay. It had been opened. And closed again, carefully, deliberately. I lowered myself to my knees, ignoring the ache in my joints, brushing dirt away with trembling hands. The surface of the lid bore faint marks, not from age, but from repeated handling. Someone had been here before me, recently, more than once. My stomach tightened as a wave of understanding tried to force its way into my mind. And I resisted it with everything I had. This wasn't grief. This wasn't remembrance. This was maintenance. I forced myself to stand, stepping back as if the grave itself might reach out and grab me. My pulse roared in my ears. I looked around the cemetery, suddenly aware of how isolated it was. The trees stood motionless, the wind silent, as though the world was holding its breath along with me. I covered the grave as best I could, my movements rushed now, clumsy. Driven by a growing fear that had nothing to do with ghosts and everything to do with the living. I drove home without remembering the road. That evening, my wife returned at her usual time. She moved through the house calmly, set her bag down, washed her hands at the sink. I watched her from across the room, my chest tight, my eyes searching her face for something, anything that might explain what I had seen. But her expression was serene, untroubled, as if she hadn't just come from a place that had shaken me to my core. She asked me how my day was. I told her it was quiet. That night, sleep never came. I lay there listening to her breathing beside me, steady and peaceful, while my mind replayed the sight of that coffin over and over again. Questions stacked on top of each other until they became unbearable. Why was it opened? Who had opened it? And why did my wife visit that grave every Friday as if something down there depended on her? In the days that followed, I became a stranger in my own home. I watched. I listened. I noticed things I had ignored for years. The locked drawer in her study. The faint smell of earth that sometimes lingered on her clothes. The way she checked her phone late at night, turning the screen away from me even though I never asked to see it. Every answer led to another question. The following Friday, I didn't follow her to the cemetery. I followed her somewhere else. She left the house the same way she always did. But instead of heading toward the old road that led to the graveyard, she turned onto a side street I had never seen her use before. I stayed far enough back to remain unseen, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they began to ache. She drove with confidence, as if this route was familiar, practiced. She stopped near a quiet property at the edge of town. No sign, no lights. Just a long driveway disappearing behind a line of trees. She parked, stepped out, and walked toward the structure without hesitation. I waited, counting my breaths, every instinct in my body screaming at me to turn around. IDN single quotes T. I got out of the car and followed on foot, keeping to the shadows. The building came into view slowly, its outline stark against the fading light. I could hear movement inside. Voices low, controlled, purposeful. My heart pounded as I edged closer, pressing myself against the cold exterior wall. Through a narrow window, I saw something that made my knees weaken. There were files, equipment, familiar tools. And at the center of it all, a photograph of a man I recognized immediately. The name on the grave suddenly felt meaningless. Because whatever my wife had been visiting every Friday, it wasn't just a grave, and whatever she had buried years ago was not as gone as I had been led to believe. I don't remember how long I stood there outside that building. Time lost its shape, stretched thin by the pounding of my heart and the cold realization creeping up my spine. The photograph taped to the wall inside wasn't old. It wasn't faded or curled at the edges. It was recent, sharp, clear, printed on fresh paper. The man in it stared straight into the camera, eyes alert, alive. The same man whose name was carved into a headstone I had just disturbed with my own hands. Her first husband, buried, mourned, remembered. And somehow, still central to whatever this was, I stepped back before I was seen, retreating into the trees as quietly as my stiff legs allowed. I watched my wife enter the building like she belonged there, like it was an extension of her routine. No hesitation, no fear. That terrified me more than anything else. Whatever waited inside those walls was not a surprise to her. It was something she had planned for years. When she finally left, I stayed hidden, counting every second until her car disappeared down the road. Only then did I force myself to move. My body felt heavy, reluctant, as if it understood the danger my mind was still trying to deny. I circled the building slowly, scanning for cameras, listening for footsteps. The place looked abandoned from the outside, peeling paint, boarded windows, weeds choking the entrance. A lie, a deliberate disguise. The door was locked but not well. It opened with a quiet protest, and the smell hit me immediately. Old paper, metal, dust, and something else underneath. Something clinical. The kind of smell you associate with rooms where secrets are kept. Inside, the space was larger than I expected. Tables lined the walls, covered in documents, maps, notebooks filled with handwriting I recognized instantly. My wife's, neat, precise, methodical. Each page detailed dates, locations, names. Fridays were circled again and again. Graves, storage sites, transfers, payments. This wasn't mourning. This was a long-term operation. My hands shook as I picked up a folder and opened it. Inside were photographs taken over decades of people entering cemeteries, of unmarked vans parked at night, of sealed containers being moved from one location to another. Some images showed the same grave from different years, the soil disturbed in subtly different ways. Maintenance, just like I had feared. And then I saw it. A section labeled Preservation. I dropped the folder like it had burned me. The truth assembled itself slowly, piece by horrifying piece. Her husband hadn't died the way she said he had. The grave was real, but the body inside it wasn't permanent. It was a decoy. A placeholder. A stage prop in a performance meant to last a lifetime. Whatever he had been involved in, whatever they were involved in, had required him to disappear. Not to die. And my wife had been the keeper of that disappearance. For 12 years of marriage. She had lived beside me, slept beside me, while maintaining a second life built on lies deeper than any grave. Every Friday, she hadn't been visiting a memory. She had been protecting a secret that could destroy more than just our family. Footsteps outside snapped me back to reality. I froze, heart slamming against my ribs as a shadow passed across the doorway. I barely had time to duck behind a shelf before the door opened again. A man entered, older, thinner, but unmistakable. His posture was different. His hair was grayer. But his eyes, the same eyes from the photograph, alive, breathing, very real. I pressed a hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. He moved through the room confidently, checking documents, adjusting items, clearly familiar with every inch of the space. This wasn't a hiding place he visited occasionally. This was a base. A control room for a life that never truly ended. Then he spoke. "Did you cover the grave?" My wife's voice answered from behind him, calm, efficient. "Yes, no one saw." The words felt like knives. Not just because of what they meant, but because of how normal they sounded. As if this conversation was no different than discussing groceries or bills. I backed away silently, every instinct screaming that if I stayed 1 second longer, I would never leave. I escaped the building the same way I had entered, lungs burning, mind racing. By the time I reached my car, my hands were numb. At home that night, I watched my wife more closely than ever before. Every gesture, every word felt rehearsed now. I realized something chilling then. I wasn't just married to a woman with a secret, was living with someone who had mastered deception over decades. And if she could hide a man from the world, what else could she make disappear? I knew one thing with terrifying certainty. The grave wasn't the end of this story. It was only the surface. I don't sleep for several nights after that. I lie in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to my wife breathe beside me, and I realize how dangerous familiarity can be. For years that sound meant comfort. Now it feels like a countdown. I understand something deeply unsettling. The most effective lies aren't dramatic. They're routine. They repeat quietly until they become invisible. And I was invisible by design. I begin to move through my days differently. Slower, more deliberate. I speak less and listen more. When my wife talks about errands, about Fridays, about the small rituals she's always had, I nod like I always have. Inside, I'm measuring everything. Timing, patterns, weak points. I'm not angry. Anger would cloud my judgment. What I feel is colder and clearer than that. I return to the cemetery again, not to dig, not to search, but to observe. I sit on a bench like an old man with nowhere to be, and that's exactly what people see. Caretakers come and go. Vehicles appear at certain hours, linger too long, then leave. I write nothing down in public. I memorize instead. At my age, memory is a weapon no one expects you to sharpen. At home, I begin organizing quietly. I gather documents I once ignored. Old insurance papers, property records, financial statements that passed through my hands simply because I was the husband. I realize how much access I was given without suspicion because no one imagined I would ever use it. Trust, I learn, is often just neglect wearing a polite face. The building comes back into my thoughts constantly. Not the fear of it, but the system behind it. People like my wife don't rely on emotion. They rely on predictability. And predictability can be disrupted without noise. I don't need to expose her secret publicly. I only need to remove the conditions that allow it to survive. So I begin doing that. I change small things first. I cancel services tied to shared accounts. I update authorizations. I ask questions in places where questions trigger reviews. I let processes start that cannot be easily stopped once they're moving. I never accuse. I never threaten. I act like a man putting his affairs in order, which, in a way, I am. Weeks pass before she notices anything is wrong. When she does, it's subtle. A delay. A problem that should have been simple. A phone call that doesn't get returned. I watch her confidence fracture in tiny, precise ways. She becomes sharper at home, quieter elsewhere. The calm control she's always had starts to slip, not into panic, but into urgency. One night, she finally asks me if something is wrong. I look at her for a long moment before answering. I don't raise my voice. I don't smile. I tell her I know about the grave. About the building. About the man she buried without letting him die. I tell her I've known for a while. The silence that follows is the heaviest sound I've ever heard. She doesn't deny it. She doesn't apologize. She simply asks what I plan to do. That question tells me everything. I need to know about who she really is. I tell her I'm not destroying her life. I'm stepping out of it. I explain that I won't protect her anymore. I won't buffer consequences. I won't smooth over complications. Whatever survives without me was never built on love to begin with. She leaves the house within days. Not dramatically. No shouting. No tears. Just boxes, quiet footsteps, and a door closing the way it has closed for me emotionally for years. The Fridays stop. The cemetery visits end. The system collapses slowly, the way all secrets do when no one is left to maintain them. Months later, I hear rumors. Nothing concrete. Just whispers of problems, of people resurfacing where they shouldn't, of old arrangements failing under scrutiny. I don't follow up. I don't need to. My part is finished. What stays with me isn't fear anymore. It's clarity. I understand now that betrayal doesn't always come from cruelty. Sometimes it comes from discipline without conscience. From loyalty to the wrong thing for too long. And sometimes, the strongest revenge isn't exposure or punishment, it's withdrawal. I live quietly now. I wake up without wondering where she's gone. I pass cemeteries without feeling watched. And every Friday, I remind myself of the lesson it took me too many years to learn. If someone builds their life on your silence, the moment you stop being silent, even quietly, their world begins to fall apart on its own.